Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with Platinum sponsors Barclays Access and Adobe, Gold sponsors Intopia Tetralogical and InfoAxia, Silver sponsors Intuit and WebAble. This session is co-hosted by Steve Faulkner and Makoto Ueki. I'm Makoto from Tokyo, Japan. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. And if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the hashtag ID24 for our Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the inclusivedesign24.org event website. Steve?
Thank you, Makoto, and welcome to Simon Hayhoe, who's up next, and his talk is titled Participatory Co-Design, Grounded Methodology, and the Development of Post-Inclusion. And that's Simon Hayhoe. Take it away, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, world, and welcome all the people who have tuned in for Inclusive Design 24. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's a great honor to be here today. And I'll just explain the first slide. You can see a picture of an abbey and a steaming hot Roman bath in front of you, but you're not in Rome. You're actually in the British West Country, where I come from. This is the city of Bath. Although I'm a bit of a fraud because I'm actually in Wiltshire at the moment. I'm actually sort of almost halfway between Bath and Stonehenge. So that's just giving you a bit of a background. I'm just going to try and verbally describe some of these images as we go through, because I mostly work with visual impairment. First thing I've got to do is apologize for the title, which does sound like a PhD thesis. It's not, I promise you. And these are actual real projects we've been doing with real people, and hopefully making the world a bit more inclusive and talking about what I mean by post-inclusion. So I'll skip over the abstract. If you want to read these slides, I'm going to put them up on my university website. So if you just Google my name, Simon Hayhoe, it usually comes up with my Bath University page first of all, and hopefully my slides will be there very soon when the libraries got to put them up on the publication site for me. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to do a quick presentation outline. I'm going to present a brief history of disability and exclusion, and inclusion, of course. And that's my main subject. So I know there are different types of inclusion we're talking about in Inclusive Design 24 today, but my topic is very much geared towards providing access and inclusion, very importantly, inclusion for people with disabilities. And within that, I work mostly, as I said previously, with people with visual impairment, but I work with people with all sensory impairments and none, and learning disabilities and mobility disabilities, for example. I myself have a hearing impairment, so this is very personal to me. And I have a family that had visual impairments and hearing impairments. So again, this is very important to me. So I'm going to present a brief history of disability and exclusion. I present a new model that I've developed for participation, for engaging people with disabilities, and that's really important. And then I'm going to present 2 case studies to show how this is done. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll know a bit more about what I do, but most importantly, think about maybe what you do and think about how you include people with disability in your own work, and particularly design work. So, approach taken to inclusion in the arts, technology and education, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about process versus product. Now, I'm from an art college background. My first degree was from an art college, and I've always written about art education. And in art education, we always talk about process and product, or performance and product if you're a performance artist. And quite often in art, these are seen as being conflicting things. So for example, in performance art, it's all about the process. It's all about how you get to what you have at the end. In education, quite often we want the product at the end of it. We want the actual education. How you get to it, you know, usually the lecturer staying up until midnight the night before writing their slides and then producing the product, which is the lecture the day afterwards. And so these things are quite often being seen in opposition, seen as 2 disparate things, not quite as the same. However, with participation, I really want these to be seen as 2 sides of the same coin. I want them to be seen as 50-50. I want them to be seen as a real life project. So in my world, process and product are very, very important. and the balance between the two is even more important. So the process, just to define this, is the way we approach the production or use of learning. That sounds very technical, I know, but it's how we come up with our learning. It's the lecturer staying up until midnight the night before actually writing their slides, or the artist actually coming up with their painting, thinking about the painting, or art or technology. And the product is something, the outcome of the object is the thing at the end, the lesson, the lecture, or the piece of art that you hang on the wall or put on the floor, or it's a technology that we carry around in our pockets. And quite often, as I said, these are seen as being very different things. So there's a first generation of the way we looked after people with disabilities, or where we talked about people with disabilities. And when I say looked after, this is very much the thinking in the early 20th century. So disability was seen as a medical issue, and that's the most important thing. Up until the early 20th century, for hundreds of years, we'd seen disability or handicap, as they used to refer to it, or blindness or deafness, because people didn't talk about handicap or disability until the late 19th century, early 20th century. And we saw it as an infirmity. It's something that took people out of society. And so people with disabilities were quite often hidden away. They were put in hospitals or asylums or institutions. And those are things I've investigated before. And so there's a citation at the bottom here. I wrote a book called Philosophy of Disability and Exclusion, which looked at these asylums in the early periods from the 18th century onwards. And the whole point about working with people with disability was to reduce their deficits and thinking about their handicap, and just to help them as a medical case. So we thought about those then. And then we came up with the second generation, and this really came after the First World War, and people started coming out of asylums a bit more, and hospitals and institutions a little bit more. And there we thought about the tasks of actually providing access for people with disabilities. And so things became more technology focused, and we thought a great deal more about producing what I call assistive technologies, or what have been traditionally called assistive technologies. And these were things like producing Braille, but not just producing Braille, which is invented in the 19th century, but producing a brailleur that helped people with visual impairment, for example, read texts or produce their own text. So we actually moved from reading to actually producing. So access was seen as separate, but included in the environment. And this is an important distinction, because even though people were in included environments, disabled people were out of asylums, they were still separated by their technologies. They had a different form of technology. And this really, and to a certain extent, this still exists. But in the 20th century, late 20th century, should I say, and early 21st century, we moved over to a third generation. And what we're dealing with, and we're pretty much there now, and this is roughly where we are in our mainstream thinking, our third generation inclusion. And this third generation inclusion is actually producing technologies that actually have an assistive element to them, but are basically mainstream. So, for example, we have something on our television. When I sit down on my television at night and I watch the television programs, because I have a hearing problem, sometimes I put on the subtitles. And I can do that because there's now a device within my mainstream technology, my mainstream television, that allows me to turn on subtitles because I can't hear the text, hear the speech very well. And people with visual impairment have an audio description on their television. They have an audio description button for certain channels. So this is a big leap forward in inclusion. We've reached a good stage in inclusion, where we're thinking about how we can include people in mainstream society using those mainstream technologies, but with adapted devices. So I have to put on my subtitling, and then my children go berserk because they can't see the full program, or they can't see the football, they can't see what's going on the television. But I can read what's going on, and I can actually, see the words rather than try and strain to hear the words. And those devices exist in mainstream technologies. So I call these technologies inclusive technologies, and how I define them, I define them in a recent book chapter I published last year as a mainstream technology can be used with either no or minimal adaptation by a person with a disability as an accessible technology. And it's also seen as a technology that provides social inclusion, such as communication and interaction for people with disabilities. So we're at a pretty good place now. And perhaps the best example of these inclusive technologies are mobile technologies, things we use ubiquitously now. We don't even think about our mobile technologies. Everyone nowadays asks me what my cell phone or mobile phone number is. And these are iPads. I don't want to use brand names, but there you go, iPads, iPhones, or I've got my Samsung Galaxy right next to me right now. And these have accessible features, so I can change the color, for example, if I have a visual impairment. If I have low vision, I can change it to black and white, so I can see it more easily. And I've also got functions like Siri, which actually started out as an accessible technology. Not many people realize this, that all these mainstream technologies started out as accessible technologies in the first place. So I can use Siri to use a voice control if I'm visually impaired, and I can also hear what's on the screen visually. So I've got a text-to-speech function, for example. So these are pretty much where we are now. But we need to go further, because I think we're reaching, and we're just starting out in the foothills of a fourth generation of inclusion. And I call this post-inclusion because the aim of post-inclusion, or inclusion 2.0 if you like, is to actually make technologies with people with disabilities or with people who are previously excluded from society, and by helping or getting their participation, their help in actually making the technologies, and it's all about them helping us rather than us helping them now, we can actually design better technologies, more able technologies, more enabled technologies, thinking about in our design what people really want, not trying to second guess what a visually impaired person wants or trying to second guess what a hearing impaired person wants, but actually building that into our design process. So this is where the process becomes as important as the product. And what I mean by this is, in my case, education, arts and technologies consider accessibility as standard. It doesn't become a bolt-on extra. It's not that text-to-speech function or these standard settings that you can change, but building them into the mainstream part of our technology or our education or our artwork even. They're usable and can be studied by as many people as possible. So I can go along to a computer science course and I don't have to learn, for example, assistive technology as a separate person, but I can learn mainstream technology that is accessible. And that's what we're working to at the moment in our academic lives. Person-centered, not group-centered. So we're actually thinking about the needs of all individuals, but it's going beyond universal design, for example. We're not actually just talking about universal design. We're talking about actually getting people's needs and wants in their own mainstream technology, and artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things can help with this. So for example, if I can set up my computer to deal with all my needs, and I've talked about this recently in a separate conference, then I can walk around and that information can follow me. So I can turn on a television in New York or Tokyo or Japan, or in Beijing or in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and it will know my settings immediately. It might be beamed by the Internet of Things. I might have some form of device with me that actually plugs in and tells them what my needs are. But that television knows immediately what I need and what I want, and it can also learn about my needs and my wants as well. So that's the kind of thing we're working towards. And to do this, we really need to work with participatory co-design to develop our artworks, to develop our technologies, and to develop our education. And what do we mean by participatory co-design? So developing participation, this next part is. Well, for me, there are always three parts to participatory engagement to actually develop participation in the design of good education, good artwork, and good technology. First of all, you've got to develop and encourage participatory engagement in the people who are your target audience. So for example, if you're working with people with disabilities, you've actually got to go out to them and explain what participation is and why they want to be involved in it. Because lots of people think that technology isn't for them if they are disabled. And that's one of the biggest barriers we've had to overcome recently. Develop a community of practice and good practice and what good practice is. The second element of this is model and trace pathways to impact and the legacy of that. So, for example, we don't just learn it about one product and then that's it, we've designed that product, we'll walk away now and then just go back to our normal lives. We've got to make this part of a culture. We want to have impact and a legacy to our participation that can affect other technologies in future, that can affect our entire culture of access and our entire culture of education and technological development and artistic development. We also need to coordinate participatory engagement. And what I mean by this is we need to have an engagement toolkit that we can take around with us, because there is a problem with engagement at the moment and participation at the moment that we have. So for example, I've worked in projects where I've worked with participation in schools, I've worked with participation in libraries, I've worked with participation in museums and universities, I've worked with people trying to blog and come up with virtual engagement, and businesses. But the problem with those is they all have their own understanding of engagement and what participation is. And we really need to see one type of engagement, and that's the real problem, because we have these understanding of disparate engagements. What's good at participatory engagement in schools is different from what's good in participatory engagement in museums. What's good in participatory engagement in universities is different from what's good participatory engagement from businesses. And so what we really need to do is come up with a cohesive toolkit that's good participation in all of those places. We need to have a cultural shift, a way in our thinking that shifts to actually come up with a new way of participating and engaging with people in our design, in our education, and in our artwork. And so I've come up with a very simple model, developing a participatory engagement model. And these are the considerations that we always think about. And I've tried to keep this simple, so it's not academic in any way. It's what we do when we try to develop our own participation for projects is we think about who we're going to engage, where we're going to engage them, and lastly, when we're going to engage them. Very simple: who, where, and when. So, for example, who to engage could be the stakeholders that we're working with. And so the first thing we think about when we're developing our engagement is who our stakeholders are. And they can be institutions, they're the main stakeholder. And let's not squeeze schools out of this, and technology companies and institutions like museums and libraries and so forth. We need those people to be part of the process, because if they don't buy in, then nothing will get done. They'll just keep on doing things as they did in the past. We need the people that we're teaching or we're creating the technology for, or that we're creating the artworks for, to be involved. That's the main point. We need to get those stakeholders into the loop. But also, we need to think about the teachers as well. So people teaching, the people who are actually providing that inclusion, the people who are actually selling the technology, the people who are actually teaching the classes and the lessons, and also the people who are making the artworks, the artists themselves, because if we don't get them involved, again, there's going to be no buy-in for the whole of this engagement. Okay, so where to engage? Well, now we have a big choice. We have virtual engagement, and inclusive design is a perfect example of this. Virtual engagement is getting people together on the internet through Zoom, for example, through Teams or whoever. I don't want to mention brand names again. But we could get people together discussing and creating communities of practice and communities of learning within that virtual engagement. And then we can do physical engagement. And of course, pandemic has put this all on kibosh, and virtual engagement has become virtually everything nowadays. But we still have physical engagement. We want to see people in classes. We want to see people in galleries. We want to see people in museums. And that physical engagement is really important. So we have to think how we can merge that virtual engagement with the physical engagement. Then we have a look at what virtual engagement can be. Well, first of all, we can have blogging, which could include micro-blogging, just putting on tweets, for example. If everyone's on Twitter now, hopefully asking me questions, hopefully put on your questions, please. We have micro-blogging, just short questions, putting people over, developing understanding of things. Then we have virtual learning environments. Now, these are very important in my world, in university world and school world, because virtual learning environments are really important for developing people's base of learning. So where we can actually put in documents that people can read, we can actually have a YouTube channel, we can have YouTube clips within our learning, and actually understanding where we need to engage with people virtually through the internet. So if we can put that all in one place, we can create something called a MOOC, which is a massive online course, or we can have just a virtual learning environment for normal students, regular students. I say normal students, obviously online students are regular students as well. But what we mean by students, I guess, is the people who turn up to schools and universities. Those are the most important people. And then we can have direct engagement. We can have chats and we can have e-conferences like Inclusive Design. You can ask me questions. I can spiel and I can, gabble on for ages about certain things. And then you can ask me questions in return. So those kind of engagements are really important in participation. And of course, physical engagement, those are our traditional understanding of engagement. So we got public learning spaces, traditional ones such as museums and hospitals. We have peripatetic teachers going to hospitals. We have very formal education departments in museums. We have the very formal learning spaces, of course, we've got the schools and the universities. But we've also got informal learning spaces that people don't really think about as learning spaces that often. Libraries, for example. I mean, if you go to a library, read a book, or you learn something on a computer in a library, those are really important spaces now that we need to think of in terms of access, but also ask people why they'd want to go to a library or what they want in a library. That's a really important part. And of course, parks. I'm writing a book at the moment on access in national parks in the United States. And that's becoming a greater and greater environment for learning where our public spaces are. When to engage. Events like group meetings and seminars, those are very important engagement spaces. The media, such as schools and universities and art centres. You can have an informal learning engagement environment in schools and universities and through the media. And informal learning opportunities as well, such as the community centres and parks that I talked about. And that can be something as simple as women's groups going into a community centre and talking about their needs and their wants. Those are important participating places. Okay, so this is the science bit, as Jennifer Aniston was saying, that shampoo commercial I'm not going to mention. So this is the method of implementation of evaluation. So if you're a sort of social sciencey person like me, you've got to implement it and evaluate it. And that's what we have to think about when we're talking about participation. So there is a bit of science to this, I'm sorry about this. And there are 3 phases that we always do when we're developing participation. And I talk about something called grounded methodology, which is a methodology I've developed, and I'm just about to publish a book next month called An Introduction to Grounded Methodology for Emerging Educational Researchers. So please, this is my advert for myself here, being published by Routledge next month. And so we do our engagement in 3 phases. So this is the timed bit now. And we start off by building familiarity and testing usability with our participants that we work with. In the second phase, after we've talked about what engagement is, and we've talked about how we're going to test usability. And by the way, when I talk about testing usability, I don't mean user testing. I don't mean giving a person a piece of equipment and saying, what do you think of this equipment? How can we make it more usable? I mean, asking the participants in that open phase about what they would think of as user testing. For example, would they think of actually taking the piece of equipment around a local environment that would be user testing? Would they think about trying it at home would be user testing? So we actually build people who are participating into the design of the research itself and the design of the implementation. So it has to go that deep. It's not about end user testing. It's about building people into the design of the testing itself. In the second phase, we explore accessibility. We go out and we visit museums, we visit universities, we visit schools, and we actually say, what makes an accessible school? What makes an accessible university? What makes an accessible museum? And we talk about what that usability is. And from that point, we either go away and design our education with those people, we go away and design our technology with those people, or we go and design our artwork with those people. And I'll talk about that with my case studies in a minute. Then we have to do an evaluation, and I'm talking about dance here because I've left in dance here, and I'm going to talk about dance. But the most important thing is the product at the end of it, that balancing of process and product, and actually coming up with something that everyone's happy with. So after the product has been developed, there has to be that user testing that we developed in the open coding phase. And then we go back and ask people, is this what you thought was what was going to happen? Is this what you think of as an accessible technology? Is there any way we can change it? Is it usable? Is it not usable? So that product then becomes the very important thing. But most important in this process is going back to the open coding and actually starting this process again. So it's a never-ending process of actually designing, testing, going back and saying, oh, well, we tested it in that way last time, but we didn't think about testing it in this way this time. So how are we going to test it in this way this time? So we think of it as a cycle. We don't just stop with selective coding with the evaluation and saying, is this product more usable than the old product? We actually go back and say, well, it was more usable than the old product. However, how can we make it more usable? How can we test it better? How can we develop our whole exploratory phases a lot better? And building people into that design process. And this may take generations of people. So for example, the people who are participating at the beginning might change. They might be younger people coming in the next phase, and they're giving you different advice. They're giving you different thoughts. So that participatory phase is really, really important. And a method of evaluation, because no one's ever really defined what inclusion is very tightly. And so in my book, Cultural Heritage, Aging, Disability and Identity, which I published last year, again with Routledge, I seem to publish a lot with Routledge at the moment, we talked about what identity is. And most importantly, we talked about it in terms of 5 phases. The first phase is mobility. And mobility is within an environment, but also in virtual spaces. How you can get around a website, for example. Is a website accessible if we can get to different pages on that website? We looked at spaces and places, and this is the most important one that people always think of is in terms of inclusion. Can we get around a classroom? If we sit a child in a classroom, can they get around that classroom? How included do they feel in that space? Third part is the information. This is a really important part. Information is a very important element of inclusion. Both information as creating inclusion, but also about developing learning, and also providing independence, because people producing their own information at the end of it, not just a consumer of information. The fourth stage is learning, and I would say that as a teacher, but of course, learning is a major part of inclusion, learning about your environment, learning about your technologies, learning about art. That's always going to be a big part of inclusion. And the last thing, which was perhaps, again, the most important thing, which is bonding. Because why are you feeling included in the first place? I can feel included as a single person in a world by myself. But if I'm not with other people, I don't feel included. I don't feel truly included because I'm not with other people and I don't feel part of a community. So that bonding is feeling included in a whole community, and how technology, education and the arts allows us to do that. Okay, so now I'm on to my case studies, and I'm having to go quickly here, I'm afraid. So this is the first one we had, which is the SoundPad project. And the SoundPad project was inclusive technology for people with visual impairment who were learning breakdancing. And so we come up with our model again, our where, who and when. And our where was community centres and dance studios and schools. That's where we held this project. That's where we wanted to engage participatorily with people. Our when was during participation sessions, where we wanted to find out what people knew, what people wanted. Meetings where we held them individually with small groups. And of course, choreography sessions, which are vastly important for dance, and final performances. And then the who did we want to include in this project? Well, we thought about this, and obviously it had to be visually impaired children and adults, but it also had to be associations for the blind, because they had to buy into it as well. They were our stakeholders. And of course, a breakdance collective or breakdance collectives. And this was one up in Sheffield, because we worked in South Yorkshire. So we worked with a very specific breakdance collective up there. And I was working with a brilliant dancer called Nathan Gearing, who's a great friend of mine. He's a wonderful person. If you ever get a chance to work with him, he's wonderful. He's actually done the choreography for the Special Olympics. He's an amazing dancer as well. So I was lucky to have the Rolls Royce of dancers for this project, Nathan Gearing. So I'd like to acknowledge him certainly in this. So we came up with mobility issues and visual impairment. And the main reason we came up with this project was visually impaired people that we both worked with, Nathan and I had worked with before. So I'm going to take a slurp of tea now. Maybe British take a slurp of tea, but here we go. In our participatory sessions before this particular project, the SoundPad project, we'd come up with several problems that people who are visually impaired had told us about. And they talked about mobility as being one of their biggest issues. Movement in a space and place, the information about movement. So for example, is there a big tree in front of me? Am I going to walk into a tree? Learning about my mobility, and the technologies that can help me with my mobility seem to be the most important part of the conversation that we'd had previously with visually impaired people about what they wanted to know. And so we thought dance education could really help with this potential project, because people who dance have absolute understanding of their environment. If you understand yourself, if you're a dancer on stage, for example, you need to know where the edge of the stage is so you don't fall off. That goes without saying. But you need to know where the other dancers are, where the obstacles are that could be on that stage. So you learn about dance, you learn about movement, and most importantly, you need to learn about falling. Now, this is an interesting thing that not many people think about with dancing, but if you think about break dancing, for example, people jump up and then they go on the floor and then they spin around, and that's a form of falling. But people who are break dancers, who are trained break dancers, that can actually do this quite naturally. They learn so well that falling doesn't injure them. And this is something that people with visual impairment said they wanted to do, fall without actually hurting themselves, because a lot of people with visual impairment hurt themselves a lot. So Nathan developed his own practice, first of all, called Rational Method. And one thing that he found was good was using noises, onomatopoeic noises, to actually teach people about what breakdance moves were. So they could understand that if they hit an object, there was a sound associated with it, and so they could fall and not injure themselves so much. And he called this Rational Method, which he developed with a visually impaired theatre director called Andrew Loretto. And he wanted to, first, before he started this method, develop this for breakdancing. So he created the Rational Method for audio description. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the technology that we were working with. We were using a mainstream technology, but we were adapting it, according to Nathan's Rational Method, to actually come up with tactile caps that could fit over a mainstream dance technology, but also show colour for people with low vision, to actually help them develop break dancers themselves, so they could become choreographers. So they not only learnt how to dance, fall over without injuring themselves, but they could actually develop choreography, a major important part, or a major part of the inclusive technology or the inclusive design that we were actually developing. So they were learning, providing information, that whole aspect of the model of inclusive capital that we were developing. They could develop mobility, they could develop information through this technology. And most importantly, they could feel included in their spaces and places because of that. So that's what we were working towards. So those were our objectives that we started with. And in 2020, right at the beginning of this year, just before the lockdown, funnily enough, and at the end of 2019, we developed groups in Sheffield and in Bradford, which were sort of, if you don't know, the UK is an adjoining city, or a city that's not far from Sheffield in Yorkshire. Sheffield's in South Yorkshire, Bradford's in the kind of the middle of Yorkshire next to Leeds. And we developed inclusive participatory groups with schools, schools for the blind and mainstream schools that had children with visual impairment. And we also worked with associations for the blind in Sheffield and Bradford, as I said. So what we came up with was an adaptation of a mainstream technology, and we came up with dance moves. So within I'll just give you a short example, because we haven't got time to do this at length, but as a short example, what we did was talk about dance moves and demonstrate dance moves. I did it myself. If you ever see me, I'm a sort of pudgy middle-aged man who has no ability in dance whatsoever. But Nathan and his dance group, the Breakdance Collective, showed people dance moves by working with them physically, by showing them what a dance move was. And then we wanted to know how we could adapt our technology, and people came up with the ideas of caps that could be put over the buttons on mainstream dance machines and beat machines. And so we wanted to know what these caps would look like. And so we asked people with visual impairment to make us what they thought would be the model, or the tactile representation of those caps. And here we gave them Play-Doh. And Play-Doh is a wonderful thing to actually create tactile environments and tactile understanding, because obviously you can reshape it, but you can make things that can be redeveloped later, that can be put onto technologies. And it was very interesting. The children we worked with who had low vision, and I've got verbal images here, wanted to also incorporate color. So I'll just quickly describe these pictures in front of you now. If you have a visual impairment, we have two dance moves, two pictures. Each picture has a dance move. So the first one is called a slice, and the second one a bounce. And these are Play-Doh shapes that people built, people with visual impairment built, that they thought represented a slice. And in the first one, in the slice picture, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Play-Doh images. And they range in color from green, red, yellow, and black. And they have what might be seen as almost a Y-shaped or just a long-shaped image that became a slice. And in the bounce, which is really interesting, there are 3 images, 3 Play-Doh models in the bounce picture, and they're black, green, and yellow. And they're all of people, and they're quite pudgy people, a bit like me. And they are all sort of sitting down. So those were the bounce. So those we interpreted as pieces that we could put onto our existing dance machines, our beat machines that breakdancers use. And they were tactile pieces. And we were told by the visually impaired users that they wanted these tactile pieces so they could see and form. Now, here we have a picture in our next slide of actually dance lessons. And this is a picture of Nathan, the only picture I've got of a person, because we didn't want to use pictures of the people who are involved. But Nathan is just performing a break dance move. And on my computer, the Inclusive Design logo is blocking him out, blocking out his face, but you can still see Nathan doing the dance move. And Nathan is teaching people how to do a turn in this picture. So with the axial phase and the second phase of participation, what we did is come together and teach people how to dance. And the dance troupe, the dance collective, the breakdance collective we were working with actually taught dance moves, but most importantly, they taught choreography, because again, we wanted to have some legacy and we wanted to have some impact for this, but visually impaired people could learn how to teach other people how to dance. And our main part of this, or main part of the project, was actually having a choreography project where visually impaired people themselves who are taking part in the project could then go on and teach other visually impaired people. They could then own their own design and research. And the last phase of the project was actually come out with a performance through that choreography. And we had members of the audience. And so this was performed in a city called Derby, which is in the East Midlands, but it's not far from Sheffield. It's very close to Sheffield. Everything in Britain is not that far away. So this was slightly down the road, down the M1 in Derby. And there was a performance of the visually impaired dancers and the dance collective from Sheffield. And we had some brilliant feedback. And so one dancer who actually worked with the collective, he said what was really interesting, because he learned a lot from this participation. He said what was really interesting was that I didn't know that means the visually impaired person he was working with, his idea of a step was my idea of a dance step. We had to ask each other, is this the kind of step you mean? So we had to get involved more than choreographers normally would. And the technology helped a lot. So this is something that actually came out of the participation, because the dance collective, who were all sighted, learned something from the visually impaired audience. We knew we had impact because of that. So they were going to change their practice in future. And a member of the audience in Derby said, the sound effects gave me a better understanding of the dance moves and made the performance really enjoyable. So because we changed through rational method, the movement as well, and also the sound of the dance moves, because there was a sound associated with each dance move, it helped people understand the dancing a lot better as well. So we concluded that this was actually a course, this was actually something that we could actually develop further as educational research, and we're trying to plan post-lockdown and post-pandemic how to develop music education, dance education further through participatory practice. So that's our next project. Okay, the second case study is implementing 3 phases of a project, which is an arts project that we conducted in Bath, my home city, and the city that I showed on the first slide with the title. And this was an inclusive education project that happened between 2018 and 2019. And it was called River is the Venue, because we had a problem. And the problem is in Bath, if you know Bath, it's a beautiful old Celtic city that became a Roman city and very famous city. But it's on a river, and like Romans, good old Romans, they knew where to put cities, and they always put them on rivers. Now that was fine in the Roman era, but of course when you built up those cities in the medieval period and the Georgian era and the Victorian era, of course they flooded because you put too many houses near rivers and there was no flood zone around it, and so all of these houses got flooded and buildings got flooded, and people unfortunately lost their lives because of it. So we wanted to teach people in Bath about flooding and about how to avoid flooding and the problems of flooding, but also certainly in the 21st century, the ecological issues surrounding flooding. So again, we wanted to make this through participatory practice, and we wanted to make this with mainstream non-disabled members of the community, but also people who are mainstream but who are disabled in the community as well. So all of the members of the community of Bath, we wanted to develop a participatory education project with them. But we also wanted to particularly include people with disabilities to make the education and the artworks and the technologies we worked with more accessible. So our where was universities, parks, care homes, streets, hospitals, galleries, websites, and blogs where we could participate with people. We thought about the who we wanted to engage with. And of course, because this was an arts project, we wanted artists, arts administrators, school children, older adults with disabilities, engineers and teachers, because they were going to be major stakeholders in our project. And when I say engineers, I'm talking about water engineers as well, because they had to learn from the community how best to engage with them. And lastly, we looked at festivals and exhibitions to exhibit our artworks and also create education. We looked at seminars and conferences, and we looked at researchers' evenings and talking about our research and getting it out to the public. So the context of this, the background, quick background, public artworks in the past had always been about this chap on the right. And this is a picture of a gentleman who was a slave trader in Bristol, who's recently had his statue torn down. And he was a person who was a slave trader in Bristol, but they built a statue for him and about him. And in Bristol in the 18th century, they thought slave trading was unfortunately quite a good idea. And so unfortunately, we have quite a few people in Bristol who have statues who are slave traders put up to them as monuments. And we wanted to get away from this kind of image of traditional public artworks. So we looked at contemporary public artworks, and there's an image here in my next slide of a sculpture of a disabled woman who's on the fourth plinth or the fifth plinth in Trafalgar Square. I think it's the fourth plinth, isn't it? Next to Nelson's Column. So you've got a traditional sculpture next to a sort of next generation contemporary public artwork, which is teaching people about disability, which is great. And an artist was commissioned to talk about, to produce this artwork, and that was great. But this was not a participatory artwork because it wasn't made with people with disabilities. So we wanted to think of a way in which we could include people with disabilities and the general community in our production of artworks, but also as artworks as public education tools. So the outline of the project, very quickly, we looked at art spaces, colleges, local universities, care home residents and patients groups to actually make the artworks and actually to be part of the commissioning of artwork process. We explored the development of sensorially and intellectually accessible participatory artworks, and we examined the commissioning of artworks through our participation. So we didn't just say, right, we're going to commission artworks, what do you want in your artwork? What we said was, how do you want to commission the artists? How do you want to develop this public education? And so one of the things that came up in this initial consultation in our open phase was people said that they wanted to actually be part of the art making process. So one of the most important people that we commissioned in the end was an arts educator who came up with a wonderful public art piece that was actually made by members of the local community. And there's a picture here on the right of an old, we've only got her hands because we don't want to show her face, a lady with Alzheimer's, with dementia, who was drawing some local birds because she loved the sound of local birds in her home. And she lived in a local residential home. And so she participated in the opening phase, talking about what people wanted from artworks. And so she became one of the artists that actually created one of the artworks to teach about flooding. And of course, this is a kingfisher, just to explain to people who can't see, this is a kingfisher's used drawing. And the kingfisher was meant to represent the animals that go alongside the river that are associated with flooding. So we discussed local issues in Bath of flooding. We brought in engineers who could talk about it technically. But we also brought in local members of the community, as I said, people with disabilities who remembered flooding themselves. So they saw it as a personal memory of flooding. And we talked about what we wanted to teach. So the next part, after we commissioned our artworks, was actually getting people together and actually making the artworks, or the commissioned artists actually listening to the participatory groups and thinking about how they could make their accessible artworks more accessible and more inclusive for people with disabilities, but also for the local community as a whole. So we had to come up with a really challenging task, which is actually come up with an artwork that actually showed aspects of flooding, but was actually designed by the community itself. And so the artists had to work with the participants themselves. And this is one of the artists we commissioned, and her name is Eddie. She's wonderful, one of the very few people we can show as well. And she was the person who was commissioned to actually develop the public artwork with the people in the community. And the picture we've got here on the right-hand side, just to describe Eddie and one of her helpers in a dementia home, a home for people with dementia. And she's working on the artwork with people with dementia, but we couldn't show their faces for obvious reasons. So when we created the artwork, we wanted to exhibit it. And the artwork on the right-hand side is a sketch by a person called Mark Parrott. And Mark developed a wonderful performance piece, which was a tank which he pushed around an old pram he'd found. And by the way, the pieces that he found to create the artwork were all pieces that were old junk that could be found down by the river. He went around, scanned down by the river and found old junk people had just dumped. And then he made it into an artwork about the river. And he found an old fish tank that he made into a water tank. And he put a little diver into the water tank. And then he pushed water out on top and then drew portrait paintings of people with the water that he had from his tank. And the water was from the river itself. It stank like crazy, but it was wonderful. It was a fantastic artwork that he actually created wonderful products with. So performance artists, we had to have a performance artist as part of that process. And in our evaluation, Mark said he really thought about how he was going to do his participation and how much he'd learned from actually working with participants. And so this is his quote that I put on the slide. Having grown up in this area, he came from Keynsham, where I come from, which is just outside of Bath. Excuse me. The stories of the disastrous floods were often recounted, particularly on car journeys through Pensford, which is a local village just outside of Bath. Although I started with a plan for my River as the Venue piece, I left space for its framework to incorporate new discoveries and development that he'd learned from the participants. This piece itself kept growing even throughout its delivery during the Forest of the Imagination, which was one of the exhibitions we exhibited in, and related events. My only concerns for accessibility were for the safety near water and traffic, because we originally wanted to put things near the river, but we weren't allowed to. As I was mostly sited away from the riverbank and roads, this was not an issue. So he'd learned a lot from that process and constantly evolved his process, even when he was performing. So he changed his performance each time. The second person who gave us a quote from their artwork also felt that she'd learned a lot from the process of participation. So it's very important that she learned from members of the local community, both people with disabilities and people without. And she was an installation artist who made these wonderful flags with sounds that made a sound every time that the wind went through the flags. They made a sort of a sound as if they were sails on a ship. And she was an installation artist, and her name was Alison. And she said at the end of the project, I have had people tell me that they have been to look at the flood markings under Halfpenny Bridge, which is a bridge in Bath, and had several conversations about the phenomenal scale of water mass around the flags, which are the flags that she put up with her artwork, to indicate when in position and how they would behave differently spread out in the flood conveyance system, which was rewarding to realise. So she felt a sense of reward from actually participating in the project, and understood and were as fascinated by the physical modelling of it as I am. So she really took the feedback from people that she'd created the pieces of artwork from. Okay, this is my last slide, you'll be glad to know. So we're almost up to time. I'll just check my time here. I think we're on time, so we've got 10 minutes left for questions if you want. So in summary, arts, technologies and education for people with disabilities have gone through different distinct eras of evolution, as I've said, first in homes, then in the environment with separate technologies, now with inclusive technologies, and hopefully now full participation in the making process. At the beginning of this evolution, both education and technologies focused on physical medical issues. As technologies and education evolved, they did more to consider the needs of all users and still consider people with disabilities as a separate user group. Slowly, mainstream technologies have started to include people with disabilities in educational development and the design process. Technology has become ubiquitous. That means we don't even think about it being accessible anymore. We just have technologies in our back pocket or in our bags. We carry them around with us. Nowadays, contemporary technologies in education, used correctly, have the potential to consider all people's individual needs. So we don't have to think of people as being disabled. We can just think, what needs does the user have, that individual user have, through artificial intelligence and maybe through the Internet of Things in future. Lastly, we need to consider this issue moving forward and co-develop and design accordingly from the ground up. And with that, I'll say thank you so much for listening. I've now been gabbling for 50 minutes. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And please, questions. I'll take another slurp of tea.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
So Steve, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do have a question via YouTube. I will just
wow, great.
Find the question. Sorry, I did have it here. and then I lost it. Hold on. Okay, so the question is, have you studied learning and inclusion in hackathons, game jams, etc.?
No, but I would love to, is the answer to that one. I myself don't know any gamers at the moment. I know breakdancers, I know artists, but hackathons would be fantastic. And anyone who wants to write to me, I don't know if we can put my email up. If you just Google,
if you want.
Yes, please. Yeah, if you want to write to me and talk about hackathons, and I think hackathons would be a perfect environment for people to participate in, because hackathons are participatory themselves. They're in a way a community of practice, aren't they? So I think that would be a perfect settings. And not just that, because it's not just an environment that can be in one place, it could be worldwide. I think hackathons could be a fantastic thing. So yes, definitely up for that.
Excellent. Another question I had, a quick question, is that obviously, in this time of COVID, it seemed like a lot of the activities that you were describing actually involve physical contact.
Yes.
How are you, and what's the modifications and the viability of doing the sort of things that you're doing, but virtually?
Now, this is a really important question, because I think, in a way, this pandemic has changed our culture. Not massively at first, but I think it's going to change our culture profoundly in future. We obviously have community sites on social media, and I've been using community sites to develop practice through that. I mean, I haven't been doing formal projects, unfortunately. Unfortunately, all research projects seem to have had the kibosh put on them since we went into pandemic lockdown. But I've been looking at the possibility of using community groups on social media sites. So, for example, Twitter or Facebook, if I can say Facebook. So community sites in which we can get background feedback about the kind of things that people want. And I can give a very simple example of this. When we went into lockdown at Bath University, where I work, first of all, we were trying to make it, we were thinking, oh my goodness me, how are we going to put everything online really quickly? Because it happened through in the middle of a semester. It didn't happen sort of at the beginning of a semester where we could plan for it. So we wondered how we could do it. So we actually went out, and luckily enough in our Moodle groups, which is our learning management system group, and through our Facebook groups for students, we asked what the kind of things they wanted were, and we talked as stakeholders, as teachers ourselves, and so we shared good practice. And so we found, for example, a little innovation is that we thought at first we should put sound slides onto PowerPoint, and that should be our way of providing access quickly. But we found that the students didn't want that, because they found it difficult to follow the slides and actually listen to us and actually read what was going on the slide at the same time. So what they wanted was a podcast, and then the slides that they could read in their own time. So two separate forms of technology, if you like, that they could sort of digest at will. So they could listen to podcasts over and over again, and then they could read the slides separately. And so that's a very small example, but it's an example of where we can learn from our students. But the main thing is that we need to come up with formal structures online now. And I think this isn't just going to change the way we develop during the pandemic. I think after the pandemic, those structures will still be there. I mean, after the Second World War, a lot of things in our culture changed because of the Second World War. And you could argue that the computer was invented because of the Second World War. So we can now build those structures for participation after this pandemic based on what we've learned during the pandemic. So I think a lot of stuff is going to be shifted online, which is a good thing, because it will make it more international. And it will make it more intranational as well. So I can learn, for example, I'm talking to people here from Australia and Tokyo on the line at the moment. It's wonderful. I mean, how could I do that normally? I'd have to pick up a telephone during my class, and it would seem a bit weird. But now I can be online and talk to people in Tokyo, talk to people in Australia, maybe people are listening elsewhere as well. So we've got this wonderful inclusive environment that, places like Inclusive Design 24 is helping me with.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that talk. There's a huge amount to unpack, and I personally learned a lot. I'm sure many other people will, and hopefully we'll be able to look for your various resources and stuff online and be able to follow up with it.
Thank you so much.
Makoto, are you?
So again, Yeah,
Sorry, I've gone off my slide now, so you can see my sitting room. Sorry.
That's fine.
it's okay. So again, thank you so much for your wonderful talk with the longest session title.
Oh, thank
どう
you.
もありがとう、Simon.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Have a good
All right,
time, everyone.
so,
Enjoy your day.
Thank you. So if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to Berkeley Access, Adobe, Intopia, Tetralogical, InfoAxia, Intuit, WebAble, Deku Systems, Adrian Lazary LLC. どうもありがとう for your patience with my Samurai English. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. See you then. Don't go away.